Welcome to BEN, the Business and Employment News Network. I'm Jonathan Funk. You're watching The Run, BEN's panel covering the 2016 presidential race. Today's panel, from right to left, Todd Seavey and Anders Kaur, Heather Woodfield and Melody Brooks. Todd is a libertarian writer and TV producer. He's the author of the forthcoming book, Libertarianism for Beginners. Anders specializes in nuclear weapons security and foreign policy. He worked for 5 years in military intelligence in Europe, Asia, and Afghanistan. He holds a PhD from Harvard University. Heather was a local organizer for the Howard Dean presidential campaign, hosting the largest meetup in the country. She is co-founder of Democracy for NYC, a citywide grassroots political action committee, and My Vote Will Count, which registered 10,000 students to vote. She holds a master's in public administration from Columbia. And Melody Brooks is director of the New Perspectives Theater Company, an award-winning multiracial ensemble committed to theater as an agent of social change. Todd, Anders, Heather, Melody, thanks for being with us. Ted Cruz, the first Republican to announce his candidacy for president. A son of Cuban immigrants, a Tea Party favorite who has crusaded as the consummate outsider ever since unseating Lieutenant Governor David DeWerst in a primary for U.S. Senate way back in 2012? 2012. That was like 3 years ago. What did he do before? Grassroots organizing, radical entrepreneurship, lowering the estate tax with his bare hands. Well, not quite that much of an outsider, it turns out. Here's the run on Ted Cruz. He went to Princeton, then Harvard. Then he was domestic policy advisor to George W. Bush, who named him director of the Office of Policy Planning at the Federal Trade Commission. In case you missed that, that's a title with the words Office, Policy, Planning, Federal, and Commission in it. Experience, outsider. Let's see how outside his economic policy really is. He says that Republicans, quote, are and should be the party of the 47%, a reference to Mitt Romney's disastrous assertion that 47% of Americans receive government assistance and therefore would never vote Republican. But Cruz supports a highly regressive flat tax and wants to abolish the IRS, not exactly stuff to directly benefit the lower half of society. And the number one talking point on Cruz's own website as far as creating jobs is concerned is repeal Obamacare. Those are good talking points on the Republican primary stump. They sound like an outsider talking. But is he? Do his economic ideas really set him apart from the rest of the Republican field, especially those like Cruz who claim the mantle of Tea Party-loving outsider status? Todd, how much is Ted Cruz ripping off Rand Paul, and why are you letting him get away with it?
It would be fine with me if all 7 billion people on the planet ripped off Rand Paul, except insofar as he's a little too mushy and pro-government at times. Ted Cruz is not precisely a libertarian, but he is at least a reminder, I think, that dealing with a principled politician is preferable to dealing with a mushy moderate any day, and a lot like the classic mid-20th century National Review sort of conservatives, he's very libertarian on economic policy. So a Rand Paul or a libertarian might disagree with him on things like the military and the drug war, but he's very good and admirably radical when it comes to economic policy proposals, and he tends to think big. It's delightful how unnuanced he is at times. So instead of just saying like, oh, I think we need a 1% budget cut over here, or oh, that program spent a little too much money, he'll say we should push for a balanced budget amendment. Great, I'd be all for it. He's sometimes been almost the only voice opposing raising the debt ceiling, that sort of thing. And a lot of people, especially moderates, are prone to think, oh, the responsible thing to do is keep raising the debt ceiling, which is about as responsible and moderate as continuing to hand your drunk uncle another bottle of alcohol because he says he just needs to get through the next couple of weeks and then he'll reform. Ludicrous nonsense. One thing that the left might actually like about him that's interesting is that he and Paul Ryan both share actually a concern Melody was expressing yesterday about the Trans-Pacific Partnership. He and Ryan are both in favor of letting Congress pick it apart, look at the details, and they said proudly in an op-ed they would like every legislator to be able to pry that thing open and make recommendations. And I might agree with Anders actually that sounds like a potential formula for confusion and chaos, but you can't argue with their small d democratic impulses on that matter. And they've even come up with a catchphrase, by the way, for their alternate plan, which is trade protection authority. They like the idea that the legislature will be watching over all the details of such agreements, but that may all be moot shortly if that deal passes. He's proposed abolishing whole cabinet level departments like the department.
And he can tell which ones they are.
That's right. Like the department, whereas his fellow Texan Rick Perry may have trouble remembering, although that could just be that Rick Perry was on painkillers at the time. So perhaps we should take pity on him, but we don't have to elect him president. Ted Cruz wants to get rid of the Department of Education. He also wants to get rid of the IRS, by the way, part of the flat tax proposal. That's admirable. I think most Americans would be down with that. He's signed the Tea Party's Contract from America, which contains a bunch of economic proposals, including routinely balancing the budget, drastically cutting spending, and decreasing regulation. Unlike the hypocritical sellout Elizabeth Warren, he wants to abolish the Ex-Im Bank, which is essentially funding for corporate marketing overseas. So he's consistent in that way, and you have to love the fact that he doesn't seem worried at all about putting these things in sort of subtle, cautious language. Although that makes me think he doesn't really think he's got a shot of being elected president. I don't think he really believes it. I mean, they're all egomaniacs, so maybe he does, but he sounds to me more like a guy who wants it to sound as right-wing as possible so that he can eventually, run the Heritage Foundation or get a gig on Fox News or what have you. Rand Paul, though people criticize him for being sounding like a weasel at times, I mean, he's trying to put these things in a more nuanced way because he might actually want to get elected. I don't know if Ted Cruz cares. I think he might enjoy talking big more than actually getting elected. But I got to admire the fact that he sticks to his guns and he tends to do what he says he's going to do, which is rare enough in politics.
Okay, a lot there to talk about. Let's start with the debt ceiling. This has been a debate in the Republican Party for several years now, and at the Tea Party level in the House, there are plenty of votes every time it comes up for a vote against raising the debt limit. But the criticism, not only from the left, but from Speaker Boehner and from others, has always been this is just to pay for things we've already spent the money on. Now we just need to pay for it. What do you say to that? It's not for new borrowing is the thing. It's not for new spending, I should say.
They'll never stop raising it if they keep being allowed to do that. They need to suffer the short-term pain of defaults and shame, and I think it would be a wonderful thing. Frankly, even if it meant a massive upheaval in the bond market, it would be a wonderful thing if people learned you don't loan money to government.
And the last time that we got downgraded over this very issue by S&P and I believe Moody's, the Treasury market actually rallied on the news because of the flight to safety that resulted. So I don't know how many times. Any response on the debt ceiling?
I just think that it's again, it's a procedural move that's been done unquestioningly for a long, long time from both parties. And as Todd said, it is really about the money that's already spent. But we always go back to what has it been spent on? That the Republicans and the right, and many on the left, unfortunately, we'll say in the Democratic Party, not the true left, don't mind spending trillions of dollars on the military. And we never talk about cutting back or the subsidies to big oil, but we can scream about, that debt has to be paid by our grandchildren. But there's no serious move to change the equation in any way. So everybody,
across
Tea
the board
Party
cuts
or
is a
Libertarian,
serious move.
What?
Across the board cuts, 10%.
Take
it down. If you go over the budget,
when you've already got a military
You're talking
budget,
about the
take
sequester.
down 10%.
when you've got
No,
a
I mean,
military budget that
she's making a
dwarfs
broad
everything.
overgeneralization. So.
When the military budget dwarfs everything, an across-the-board 10% cut is the same as a flat tax. Also, the fact that we never
it's not.
ever, it is,
No,
it
it's
is
not.
because
Has
the
nothing
military
to do
can
with the
lose
flat tax.
50% of its budget and still function just fine. Our military budget exceeds the combined budgets of the next 12 countries after us. So it's just ridiculous. And we never, look, Halliburton lost what? Misplaced, 12 or 13 billion dollars in Afghanistan, and that's just, 12 or 13 billion dollars, but we have to cut food stamps. Again, we never have the argument about what is really included in these budgets and why that nobody seemingly has a problem borrowing money for the debt ceiling when we keep the military at the ridiculous
I completely
size
agree,
that it
and
is.
I would just say it's important to remember that every agency of government is as stupid and inefficient and bad at spending as the military is.
Where does Ted Cruz stand against Rand Paul on military spending?
Well, Rand Paul unfortunately has rendered that a little ambiguous recently by saying that he'd be okay with spending more in the military if we made corresponding cuts elsewhere. I think that was a case of a bit of weasel language, but basically Ted Cruz seems more unapologetically enthusiastic about defense spending. So if you want to make defense cuts, it seems like Rand Paul is still preferable. And Rand Paul just doesn't have quite the same hawkish, let's take the fight to the enemy territories attitude that Ted Cruz.
Ted Cruz didn't used to have that, by the way.
Right.
He was totally against our having any military intervention in Syria.
He's still
originally.
He's still
but
strongly
now he
against-
turns around and now he's
Yeah.
blaming the administration for not knowing what the threat
he's
of ISIS was.
still strongly against
So
boots on the ground
he
in
may
Syria.
well be,
He
but you
wants
can't
only
have
an
it
air
both
war in
ways.
Syria.
He loves to hear himself talk. He
He's very
loves the sound of his own
pro-Reagan.
voice.
Reagan was, Reagan was his Ted Cruz's comment on Reagan is that the only country Reagan invaded was Grenada, which is a teeny country. So he's very anti-interventionist.
Technically
he's
invented.
definitely not a neocon
But
pro-intervention.
now he's criticizing this administration for not knowing the threat of ISIS.
Yeah, but his
So he didn't
answer to
want
that
any
is
involvement
air
in
war,
Syria.
not
Right, but that
boots
air
on the
war,
ground.
air war,
it's a big difference.
Well,
it's a big difference.
it's also a
Boots on the
a
ground
pretty
gets
safe,
you mired into the
it's a
country. An
pretty
air
safe
war is
bet,
a much
the air-
smaller
right,
attack.
and less useful.
He may be
right?
less hawkish than Hillary Clinton, for example, so he could be worse.
Hawkishness on spending, however. The debt ceiling we've talked about, ethanol subsidies.
He's against them.
He's against them, and that sets him apart from what percentage of the Republican field right now.
I
Most of them.
guess that would be 80%.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I assume he's your candidate then, Melody.
Oh, yeah, right.
So, Heather, you had a point a moment ago.
Just going back to the debt ceiling, I think that none of us would argue that we shouldn't keep raising the debt ceiling, but these discussions need to happen and not be used to hold the Congress hostage. We need some cross the aisle discussions going on this. These need to happen and be negotiated in advance. Why aren't they talking about this? Why does it come up to the deadline? Why are we risking our credit rating? There's no reason for that to happen except pure partisanship.
And there has also been every year a people's budget put forward by the Progressive Caucus of the Congress that balances the budget, that deals with the deficit, that works in any way, shape, or form. It's never even discussed. The American people don't know it exists. It's not debated on the floor. The New York Times doesn't cover it, the big liberal bastion newspaper. So there
But
are
it's a
other ways in which to
budget.
do it. It
It's
is
a
not a partisan.
Very
It is-
progressive left-wing budget.
So-
right,
But
and,
it's
and,
not
on-
the
and the
people's
Republicans will put
budget.
together the same kind of
It
budget
is the
that cuts
people's
social
budget.
services.
It
So
is-
if you're talking about fiscal
It's not
policy,
partisan.
you really have to say, hey, let's do a nonpartisan across-the-board 10%.
I don't know
You
what
have
you
to have-
mean
you
by
have to have-
partisan.
you have to have fiscal
Approach.
policy
It's
that's
not partisan
It's
to serve the
nonpartisan
people.
approach.
You can balance the budget by a little bit from here, more from there. There's reasons
Yeah, but
for
then
that.
you
It's
run
about
into
what their
partisan
priorities are.
argument.
Yeah, but you're
right? And everyone's
the
trying to cut
Republicans
the
wanna
other
cut
guy's
things
budget
that are
and
rounding
keep
errors.
your
We
budget.
want to cut something that's huge, the
Okay,
military.
Right.
But 10% of a big number is larger than 10% of a smaller number.
It doesn't matter. It's like the flat tax. 5% of a $20,000 salary is a much higher impact than 5% of $1 million salary. So taking 10%
That's Andrew's
from a
point. Is that not Andrew's point?
Yeah, then
No.
so you're taking much more.
But
if
it's
you're taking
harder on the
10%
people
off
at
the
the
board,
bottom.
you're
It's
taking a
harder
lot
on the
more
people
from the
that
It's harder
military
on the
than you're
lower
from
numbers.
Right, but you can't. I mean, otherwise
Yes,
you
you
just break
can.
down into partisanship.
Well, why do you have
That's
beliefs?
just a partisan
Why do you have
argument.
things that you believe in and that you want to back and fight for? If we're all going to be just, you don't want to talk about squishy.
Well, we realize
You know,
that
that's
all
like-
of this partisan bickering has never gotten the budget down, has not stopped the increasing debt. So if you
And
you
where
truly
has the
want to
biggest
deal with
increase
that,
in the debt
you
come
have to
from? The
take some
military.
cut yourself.
The military and giveaways to corporations, the fact that there's no revenue to offset it, the giveaways to big corporations.
And
There are other
Ted
ways
Cruz,
to do
by
it.
the way, is in favor of cutting all corporate subsidies. So there's
Yeah, we'd see
another
if that
thing.
would
he's-
really happen with his
But
wife
lowering
working
the
for-
corporate tax rate.
who just left Goldman Sachs, on hiatus from Goldman Sachs, whether he would really
Him and
see
his-
that.
and his
Funding
wife.
your social services now with money from future generations.
And you're
That's
funding the
what's
military
sad.
that way.
I know, and that's why I'm
for
saying
what
10% cut.
and to no good purpose. It is trillions of dollars. You might as well throw it out the window. We are earning no goodwill around the country. We are murdering innocent people on a daily basis. We are wasting it. These corporate, this corporatization of the military as well, and privatization with all these contractors, billions and billions of dollars.
And we're not
They can't
intervening
even
when
be
it's morally
accounted.
called for.
Right, and it can't
Like
be
in
accounted
Darfur.
for.
All right, Todd, you're saying better than 80% of the Republican field. Will he be better than 80% of the Republican field on holding the line on, even if it is a 10% cut on defense spending across the board, or on closing these corporate loopholes?
I think so.
That's what the Tea Party wants anyway, isn't it?
Despite people constantly claiming the Tea Party is motivated by racism and general insanity, their biggest concern is excessive spending and deep debt. And you're speaking their language if you say to them, we need to make cuts, we need to rein in the budget. Whereas some of the more neoconservative types really don't think in terms of money. They just see evil overseas and want to destroy it. So I think he would be better in that regard.
That's Ted Cruz on taxes, spending, and economics. When we come back, Ted Cruz on foreign policy. Does he believe it exists? To find out, stick with The Run.